the gauze has been kind of torn from our eyes, mostly, right? Like, I mean, I think we've spent the last, I would say, sort of Me Too spanning through the summer of 2020 and Black Lives Matter until now. Like, I think that the gauze has been torn away a lot more than it has been before, but we have not progressed to the stage of figuring out what to do about it constructively from there. Like, I think we're still in sort of the grief and the anger and the what the hell do we do now phase of things.
I mean, I think we're seeing with the Oscars and some of the other award shows, the Emmys, I think we're seeing a lot more representation of women of color in the talent categories, like in, you know, the actress and the writer categories, but not as many when it comes to some of the more technological aspects of the industry. There's just not as many of us doing those more technical jobs. And they're harder to get. They're harder to get into. There's a barrier in terms of just the cost of getting into the more technical aspects of the field are prohibitive for a lot of people. So you're not seeing as many in the award shows. You're not seeing as many women of color winning awards for non-acting roles.
Gotten to the position of creating my own work and trying to build my own set spaces. The other side of it was feeling a little bit alone, I guess. I would just say that, like, especially in school, in my classes, not at Boston Arts Academy, but maybe further on in college, I did feel like in my screenwriting classes, I would be like the only woman in the class or the only woman of color in the class. And that has its own pressures and discomforts. And you just, you kind of feel like you can't be the voice for every single woman or person of color. And when you're the only one in the room, it can feel a little bit lonely, if you will.
Things like my first job in television, I was working on a union set, and I had, you know, these Teamsters who were these big dudes with like fierce attitudes, and they had, you know, their way of doing things, and they didn't really want to listen to a young Black woman who wasn't very experienced. But I was an associate producer on a production, and I remember being made fun of because my voice is a little high pitched. So I remember learning to drop my voice down an octave lower so that I would sound more authoritative when talking to these Teamsters instead of talking up here where I usually talk.
A lot of it is a function of the kinds of movies that get made. So it's not that, Hollywood has ignored Black stars or audiences entirely. It's just they stick them in, here's the house party movie, or the barbershop movie. And so there aren't as many awards titles, those sort of prestige awards titles starring people of color. They just didn't think that that's what those audiences necessarily wanted, or that you didn't see a lot of like all Black dramas and stuff like that, like you're seeing now with like Judas and the Black Messiah. It's a function of what scripts get greenlit, who they get greenlit by, right? Who are the executives working in the industry? They're mostly, white people and white males, who were hiring a lot of their friends and, who were other white males to tell the stories that they wanted to tell, which also involved a lot of white males. And so, yeah, the Best Picture lineup was always sort of male stories, driven by male protagonists, that kind of stuff. And I think that you're starting to see a groundswell and a change in the kinds of movies that are nominated for Best Picture, because the executive ranks are becoming more diverse and more inclusive, and they are welcoming those kinds of storytellers as well.
Financing is a place that it shows up very extremely. There's been a long-held belief that films about women don't make money, and that films about people of color don't make money, which is not true. We have data that shows that that's specifically not true, and in fact, those films at the moment make more money per dollar spent, because those populations, which are, like 70% of the country, are so underserved that if you make a film for those populations, it makes money, which is just like common economics 101 basic sense. But nevertheless, that's been sort of this like colloquially held belief in Hollywood that's just sort of passed around. And when I started making my first film, I cannot tell you how many times I was told that by executives or producers we were meeting with, like, well, what you films about women don't make money, nobody wants to see them, you're going to have to make something else. Could you add a lesbian sex scene? Could there be some blood? Maybe then more people would see your movie. And I was just so floored by that. And I think, that was in 2011. So I think people, for the most part, know better than to say those things out loud anymore. However, it doesn't mean that those beliefs aren't still there and they're not still driving. And the reality is that it was never true that films about women and by people of color and about people of color didn't make money. That was never true. It's just this thing that's said to propagate the ability of the people who want to, the white guys in charge who want to make movies about themselves and for themselves. It just is an excuse to allow them to do that. So that's a big place. And of course, the problem is that with film and television, unlike, say, I don't know if you're a book writer, you can just sit down and write a book, right? There may be obstacles. You may not have the time. It may be hard. It may be whatever, all these things. But you can do that without resources. But you can't make a film without significant resources, right? You can make it on your iPhone, but whatever. But really, the films that are going to really play, you can't do it. And so there's this enormous initial hurdle you have to get over of at the financing stage of convincing people that you can do what you say you can do in terms of making this film and making it good and making it something that people are going to want to watch, which puts this huge roadblock outside of these sort of common misbeliefs about the money thing. It brings up all this just sexism and racism that's baked into our society, right? Like, we're less likely to trust women with big responsibilities, big budgets. That was the other thing we got told, is like, you're going to need a man on board so that people can trust you with their money, right? There's the availability bias of if a young white man comes in and asks and says, like, don't worry, give me this money and I can make this huge, amazing film. Their brains are going to go, well, he seems like a young Spielberg, right? I bet I'm going to believe him. That's probably true. Whereas if a young black woman walks in and she says, I'm going to make this incredible movie, give me this money, trust me, they're going to go, I don't know, I can't really think of anybody who's, like, for some reason, I can't think of anybody who's done that. And not that they're thinking this consciously, but this is the availability bias. They're going to be less likely to believe her without even realizing that that's what's happened.
It's hard to get into the unions if you're not getting the jobs. You can't build up the hours necessary to get into the unions, and then if you're not in the unions, you're not protected by the unions. So what ends up happening is you have a lot of women of color who are working outside of the union protections. And then you have a lot, and with that comes a lot of abuse and a lot of discrimination. But then you also have the fact that there are a lot of women of color who get to a sort of glass ceiling. I don't want to use that word, but they get to a place where they can't move beyond that because they're not in the union. And so I think something like 39% of women in the industry leave the industry because they can't move forward, because they can't get to union status. So it has a huge impact. Like, if you can't get the hours you need to get into the union, then a lot of people give up on their careers.
You don't have to earn back the money on streaming, right? There's no box office results that someone can point to. Like, we hear about the wins in streaming, right? When Netflix says a zillion people watch 2 minutes of Bridgerton or Squid Game or whatever it is, but you never hear about all the rest. And so you're allowed to fail. And I think that's a big deal, is that, when movies starring Black people or movies directed by women, when those would fail at the box office, everyone would know and get skittish about it. And this is a town that's ruled by fear. Fear rules every decision that gets made. And so with streaming, I think that those failures, which are, in quotation marks, those perceived failures can be covered up a little bit better. So there's more opportunity to fail, and that allows for more chances to be taken.
Yeah, I mean, I think these things are much more institutionalized in Hollywood, right? Because it's an institution. So there are just mechanisms where it's more strongly baked in. So I think it's harder there. However, independent film is really hard, and you still have to raise money. I mean, again, like, you can shoot things on your iPhone, but like, talking about, films that are going to get seen and things like this, you have to raise money, which is, again, disproportionately harder. But I do think independent film is the space where these voices can find the most, can tell their stories and find their audiences. And I think we've seen that increasing movement of, particularly with social media and crowdfunding and these things that make it more possible to sort of gather resources from broader networks instead of like, this one guy is going to write me a check, right? That's really helped that. So I do think independent film is better. Not that film has always been where trust fund kids thrive, right? Because if you don't have to work, if your parents can write you a check, if that all makes it easier. However, I do think that that's the space where this is continuing to grow, in terms of historically marginalized voices gaining traction.
I mean, I think the older I've gotten, obviously, like I make choices to surround myself or to put into roles on set, on my indie sets, right? Because I'm like, they're, if they're low budget and independently produced by my production company, La Palomita Productions, I feel like it's a smaller scale thing, and I have the power to say, I want this director of photography, and this director of photography is a Black photographer. This is a Dominican photographer. This is a photographer who's a woman of color. I want to work with people in my communities because it's a choice that you make intentionally because this is what I want. So I feel like now, I surround myself with artists of color because I want to I want to work in my community with my community. Like, that's really important to me.
Well, that's the thing that worries me the most, I think, is the way in which that makes a person feel invisible to our society. That if you are watching the stories, what stories a society chooses to tell is so important. It's like one of the most important things, because it says we're telling each other what we value, who is important, who is not important, who we should be afraid of, who we should look up to. And so if you're watching these stories that our society chooses to tell and you don't see yourself there, what is that message? It says you're not valuable enough to be included in, to be held up in our society. And that is awful. I mean, I can imagine almost nothing worse than that feeling, and there's so many studies, and I have more of these stats for women broadly than specifically for women of color, but just, the Gina Davis thing of if you can't see it, you can't be it until you can see it, and that, like when the Hunger Games out, female participation in archery went up like 105%, something insane. Not that that's like super important that women are doing archery, but just that as an example of how you see it and then you do it. And so if you're not seeing that the possibilities for yourself of, being president or being in high-powered jobs or whatever, just having a happy life, like being just being a person who's living a good life in the stories we tell, it becomes that much harder to imagine that for yourself.
I think it can be discouraging. I think, if you're looking for a role model, if you're looking for a mentor, if you're looking for somebody who's been there and done it, if there aren't a lot of people who've been there and done it, it's hard to find support. And it's also hard to know that you even have these options available, there aren't a lot of women who are doing like special effects stuff. Special effects don't have a lot of people of color or a lot of women in those industries. And so it's hard for young people to even know that those things are available if they don't see people of color in the industry doing that work.
Well, I mean, it affects me in the same way that it affects all of us, which is that we are less aware of that perspective and that the diversity of that perspective, right? And that we need to hear those stories. I mean, we need to hear, and what's happened more and more recently, again, in this sort of like, well, everything's fine, is like we're getting better representation on screen. We are seeing more women in leading roles. We are seeing more people of color in leading roles. We're seeing more stories about more people, but the behind the camera numbers are changing at a much slower pace in terms of directors, writers, editors, producers. So what's actually happening is we're seeing a broader diversity of stories, but from a very similar perspective, still through the white male gaze. And that to me is even more dangerous in a specific way because we feel like we're getting a broader perspective and we're not, by and large. There are obviously exceptions. So I think, how does it impact me? I don't get to benefit from those stories, right? I don't get to expand my own worldview and my understanding of what these various and diverse human beings are experiencing, and that sucks for me. Like I would like that. I would be a better person with that, and my life would be more interesting. So, yeah.
That's hard. A lot of companies have diversity, equity, and inclusion departments or DEIA, people in place to sort of help them with their diversity goals. That said, a lot of companies are really performative. They do it so they look good. They don't necessarily do it because they believe in it. And so what would be really helpful is if there was less gatekeeping, if there were more women of color in higher positions, that could help the people and the powers that be see that, you're missing out on a lot of really good talent by not making ways for people of color to advance.
The industry doesn't seem like it wants to change, and the world around it continues to want to change. And the industry is meant to, or if you will, the art making world, the filmmaking world is meant to reflect the times. And so there needs to be more intentionality about seeking out female directors, seeking out female writers, and creating spaces where women can thrive in this industry. And until that happens, it's going to keep being like what it is, sort of just playing out and seemingly like the boys' club, when really, again, there's so much beautiful work done all around the world by incredibly talented women filmmakers, because we exist. And it's just about, creating a platform where we can shine and be taken seriously.
Entertainment journalism is now focused on Marvel and Star Wars and all this stuff. And so all these sort of thoughtful indie movies, where people are starting out, they kind of fall through the cracks because there's no incentive to write about them because nobody knows what they are. And so they don't click on stories about them. So it's like this perpetuating cycle. And I think we have to take it upon ourselves to move away from the click-driven stuff and say, all right, instead of writing my 85th story about Spider-Man, I'm going to write 84 stories about Spider-Man. And the 85th one is going to be about this Iranian movie from, this female filmmaker who escaped, the Taliban or whatever the hell it is,
The audience can make a point of going to see film and watching television and short films and supporting artists who are making diverse art.
When you're watching a television series that you really like, oftentimes each episode is directed by a different director, or one director might direct a couple episodes within that series. Paying attention in your credits, like don't get up when you're done watching the movie or turn it off. Like sit and enjoy the credits and see how many, I suppose, like female names that you might see or seek out to see, or female or trans directors, and seeing who they are and what they're doing, and kind of, following their work, follow them. If you enjoyed an episode of, I don't know, any show you're watching, whatever, Succession, and you say, oh my gosh, this is directed by X person, and then you Google them or Wikipedia them and you say, okay, this is a female director from Boston or whatever, and then you start looking into their work and seeing what other episodes did they direct, or what films did they direct, or what else work have they done, and making an intentional choice. I think that when we're fans of cinema, a lot of the times we know who the auteurs are, and we know they are like Spike Lee and Wes Anderson and Pedro Almodovar, and we know their work, we know their style, and we follow them. Like if we see, like for instance, for me, I mean, I listed them because they're some of my favorites. Like if a Wes Anderson film is coming out, I know that I want to see it. I'm excited to see his work. So making an intentional choice to follow female directors and get excited about their work and follow them, follow their journey. That could be something that changes the game as well. Like, you know, and there are a lot now. I think there are a lot more now, and there will continue to be more in terms of names that we know, like, you know, but also to follow the directors of the names that we don't know per se, because there's so many people working. There are people out here, women doing work out here, and you might not know their name. Like you don't know exactly, you know, their name isn't like a top billing kind of thing, but they're constantly producing and directing work. And to follow them intentionally, I think could be one way maybe.